Andrew, welcome. And I'm going to begin with a wee introduction, if that's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, everybody, writers, readers, everyone who's tuning in tonight, Andrew O'Hagan is one of Scotland's own. He was born in Glasgow, he grew up in North Ayrshire, he studied at the University of Strathclyde, and he divides his time now between London and Edinburgh. He is without doubt one of the most exciting contemporary writers in Britain today. 3 of his novels have been nominated for the Booker. He's won numerous other awards. He's also a relentless investigator and powerful writer of non-fiction. He often talks about the blurred lines between writing fiction and non-fiction, and he ghosted the autobiography. When he was ghosting the autobiography of Julian Assange, he said that it required all the skills of writing fiction in order to penetrate and portray the often bizarre world of Assange. Andy is editor-at-large for the London Review of Books. He's visiting professor of writing at King's College London, and his latest novel, Mayflies, has just hit the bookshelves to great reviews, and also it happens to be sold out in Waterstones in Princes Street just this morning, so what can you say? So thank you for being here.
It's lovely to be here.
Thank you. Congratulations, and thank you also for agreeing to be the chief judge of our short story competition.
Well, it was a pleasure. I mean, exciting to, be returned to the coalface, as it were, of contemporary writing, because as a writer, as you know, you're on your own with your own projects, so it's nice to actually come out of your own space and see what other writers are doing, and some of them are writing so well that it gives you something to think about before you go back into your own office.
Well, I'm going to ask you a few questions that I know writers who enter the competition would love to know about. So, basic 101. What is it that you look for in a short story?
I think, initially, on that first read through, what you're looking for is economy of language, brevity, but also a sort of power. There needs to be a power within the short story that's apparent almost from the first sentence, if not from the first words. There is no space in a short story for that kind of elongation of intention and tone. You don't arrive eventually after 200 pages, as you do with Dostoevsky, at not only the point, but as it were, the style and the tone of the thing. The short story, you've got to be in there precisely from the top of the piece. So what you're looking for in that first read through is whether it has a voice or not. So much writing is similar to other writing. You're looking for that vital spark, that essential signature of individuality. And all the great short story writers, whether they be Chekhov or Alice Munro or James Kelman and Ernest Hemingway, they all have a signature. It's almost written in invisible ink between the lines. And that's what you're looking for, is a touch of that.
Right. When in your own writing, you seem to have get a real enjoyment out of the words you use. There's often quite a lot of humour in your writing, but it's not even when you're writing humorously. Sometimes there's just a turn of phrase that makes me smile anyway, just the way in which you use words. There's a sort of freedom and fun and fluidity in the way you write. But there's also a great economy, as you're talking about there isn't so much. Do you edit constantly as you're going along, or do you write in that way?
Editing's the key. I'm almost moved to quote what somebody said, that there's no such thing as writing, there's only rewriting. And there is something in that it never flows straight onto the page and is done. Only in movies. There's a very funny scene in the movie of Dr. Zhivago, where the writer played by Omar Sharif is sitting at a rather elegant écritoire, and he lifts his feather, and in about 3.5 seconds he writes the sonnet to Lara, and then puts it down and goes upstairs. In real life, as we like to think of it, it's just sweat, labour, perspiration, endless rewriting, editing, fixing, going back again, adding, subtracting. That is the joy and the labour of serious writing. Only amateurs think they can dash it off. There's no dashing off. And so yes, you're right, the editing is perhaps, next to the original composition, is the most important element, especially for short story writers where brevity is key. I mean, one excessive sentence, never mind one excessive paragraph, can kill a short story.
No. And are you someone who goes around with a notebook constantly scribbling down ideas and turns of phrase and characters and settings? Do you have a whole stock of story ideas that you're keeping there, or for fiction and non-fiction?
Note keeping is oxygen to a writer. You've got to keep your notes. You've got to keep titles, thoughts, scraps of dialogue, hints from newspapers, ideas for character. You've got to. It's your material. You know, and a writer who isn't constantly in touch with their material is setting a very difficult task for themselves, as if it's all just going to be conjured in the second they sit down at their desk. No, certainly all the professional writers I know are very keen to keep almost a sort of mental index of possible hints, material, sometimes just words. Sometimes I find a rare Scottish word and it sits there on my desk on a piece of yellow paper for months, just waiting for the occasion when it will be used. And I'll revisit the word and I'll look to see, you know, what's the etymology, you know, what's the social use of that word. And sometimes a story will grow from that word. That has happened in the past, especially a short story.
Wow.
You'll find that it's like a seed that if properly planted, then you'll get some sort of little herb eventually will poke its way out into the daylight.
Yeah. And the characters in your writing, they're very strongly drawn. Where do they come from? I mean, like the guys in Mayflies, Noodles, Tully, Limbo, Tibbs, Hogg and co. I mean, are these guys you know or knew?
Well, Mayflies is especially autobiographical. I mean, more so than any novel I've written before. I mean, those names don't come from my life, and some of their behaviour and characteristics is invented, but the fundamental relationships in that book are from life, my life. You know, there's no denying it and no wish to deny it either. I've always been interested, as you started off by saying, in that rather porous relationship between the real and the imaginary, between fiction and non-fiction. And I'm one of those writers who's fascinated by the way they blend into each other. I've always, in a sense, looked for characters, both in fiction and in journalism, that have an especially difficult relationship with reality, you might say. And I grew up in a family who could be described as having a difficult relationship with the facts too. So that's always been a source of comedy and joy to me as a writer. And without judgment, you know, I will draw from that pool of character as much as I can. The boys in Mayflies, you know, when I hear them coming off the page, even as the author of that book, I have a sort of tickle of surprise.
Yeah, you can tell from the writing.
Oh, really? Well, because I'm glad to hear that, because for me, they were in my ear the whole time. I mean, some of those boys are no longer in the world. They died young, and others are very much with us, but their combined voices, the kind of, you know, Ayrshire Bedlam was there in my ear. I mean, I've got one ear full of the Ayrshire Bedlam that I experienced and another ear full of the Ayrshire Bedlam of Robert Burns. So there's sort of, between that, there is something that passes for a brain. I don't know what's left of it now, but the joy of language is everywhere in this game for me. And so when you read a short story and discover that it's just bursting and popping with a sort of interest in the specificity of language, especially, I have to confess, the Scots language, you know, in the way that, as Robert Louis Stevenson said, an author can have a strong Scots accent of the mind. When you see that come through, it's not a nationalistic feeling, it's an artistic feeling. You're just the joy of seeing your own homegrown words newly deployed.
Wonderful. And I mean, there's so many music and film references in Mayflies. And a huge sense of joy, I think, that comes off the page and the way you use them. Do you happen to memorize a lot of dialogue of movies? I mean, did you actually talk like that, or do you? Do you have friends that you? I
mean, the comedy of it, and it's only half untrue, is that between the years 1983 and 1989, my group of friends and I think hardly ever said anything to each other that wasn't from a movie, a film, a play, a poem, a novel that
Right.
we all loved. I mean, we were endlessly quoting. I remember getting to university and discovering the phrase postmodernist thinking. And everybody was scratching their heads and saying, what is that? What does that mean, this postmodernism? And I say, well, I know what it means. We had that in Ayrshire. It's called quoting from everything else. And I was only half joking because growing up, we were bathed, if you like, in a sense of pop culture being at the very centre of your life. If you loved the movies of Martin Scorsese, or you know, you loved The Godfather, or you loved those kitchen sink dramas, you know, starring Albert Finney, or The Taste of Honey, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, Billy Liar. We had reams of dialogue from those films ready in all situations. And my mother used to say, "Stop going on about those films and say something of your own."
You can get good arguments from films.
Yeah, that's right. Good. I mean, also good cheek, good chat back.
Yeah.
But I think that it took me a while, probably into my 20s, before that started to sort of fade away.
I guess it's like the sheer exuberance, joy and youth of the first half of Mayflies that strongly contrasts with and sets up the second half. Is that jolt, like that emotional switch where you go from laughter to fear, or I mean, it happens a lot in, hopefully it happens in the theatre, it happens in books.
Yes.
Is that jolt, is that important, that switch?
Well, there's two things there. I think it's very typical of life. I mean, in the midst of life, we are in death. You know, in a sense, all of us, even if we're having, as it were, a good time, there's always the glimmer of its ending. There's always the threat of the good time stopping. And life, I think, is full of occasions where darkness intervenes on the sunniness of our experience. That is life, in a way. And, you know, somebody the other day, one of the newspapers said that Mayflies struck them very powerfully because it was a life-affirming book about death. And that seems to me what I was going for. Try to get life into the book and the roundness of life. And I'm afraid for all of us, there is one destination, whether it's tomorrow afternoon or much later than that, 10 years or 20 years, we have no control over that. All we can say is that that was life. And living with the sudden, unexpected threat of death, even for a bunch of exuberant boys, becomes a pure reality. So for me, that negotiation, if you like, between the light and the dark, between innocence and experience, between youth and maturity, that is there at the centre of this book, and the centre of a lot of Scottish novels when you think about it. My great hero, Robert Louis Stevenson, invented a sort of way of looking at life where doubleness was at the centre, that both life and its equal and opposite cousin, death, were there for you. And that doesn't mean to say that every bright glade has to give out to nightmare or darkness. It's just a recognition, I think, that if we're going to be serious in our understanding of life, we need to take on the fact that we're all on a one-way ticket. And what does that mean while life is happening?
Let's go back to the short stories. And although actually I think everything we've been talking about is very relevant to short stories as well. Could you say a few words about any of the stories, or about the stories that you read from the...
I was very struck by the question of specificity. I've got a few notes in front of me to prompt me here, because I wrote some things down as I went along. Because the impressive thing in any short story competition, if it happens, is to see the way that different writers from different backgrounds, with different histories, economic realities, class, gender, sexuality, all of these things are brought to the page in a different way, but specifically, you know. So, there was one particular story that was set at Christmas in George Square. That story, A Christmas Surprise, where there's so many doubles going on in that story. There's a young man desperate to be with his pals, who's with an elderly relative, and you know, right from the first couple of sentences, I was inside his frustration as he was wanting to get back into his own good times with his pals. Very recognisable, very Scottish. And again, that word specificity, The writer had had the skill to use very specific psychological states of mind and language attending upon that. That it wasn't generalised. Bad writing is generalised, in my view. There was also some surprises in there. You know, the time of his life, a story where at the very beginning someone has mushrooms at breakfast, and then you see this sort of redoubling of experience. A walk on a cliff top and a fall suddenly seems to repeat itself, and he seems to meet, the character meets a version of himself and the dog again and again. Very cleverly done, brilliantly wound as a story, and controlled. Because what we're often talking about with short story is how well can the writer control the material. Another one that struck me was Hunger Point. This is a story full of mystery and good sentence writing. I was very struck by the fact that this particular writer knew how to construct a sentence in a way that was full of description, almost cinematic detail, that I won't give away the central mystery in this short story, but it was almost novelistic. It felt to me like the opening of a novel. That both gave something wonderful to the story and slightly took it away from being a short story, just ever so slightly, but no harm done. It's a wonderful piece of writing, and that's what we're in the business of judging with in a short story competition. How well in the end did these submissions, these candidates, perform the act of writing? How well did their imagination carry on to the page? Because it's a transaction. You read a short story, the reader wants to feel convinced, absolutely persuaded, just almost subconsciously, that this writer knows what they're doing and is telling them something compelling.
And so finally, I mean, what advice would you give to any writer who is planning to write a short story and submit it for the next competition?
I think the only advice is to go at it again and again and again. Don't submit work until you're absolutely convinced that it squeaks. You've done everything. It's almost like a table that's been varnished to the point where, if you put your, not like this table, if you put slid your hand across it, it would almost squeak. It's got to be like that. I've been a judge of competitions before where people hand in work which is only half imagined. It's half begun. There's spelling errors, there's grammatical errors, there's no effort made to develop the idea or the characters. Thankfully in this competition there were very few in that category. I hear from the earlier judging, by the time they got to me there was excellence in front of me. I was delighted to say. But my advice to writers is always go back again once more. It's a great big effort to push a boulder up a hill writing a short story. You ought to go for perfection. Why not?
Yeah,
Why not?
Absolutely.
That's what it's about.
Well, thank you so much.
Our pleasure. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks.